Welcome to the Superintendent's Hangout, where we discuss topics in education, charter schools, life in general, and not necessarily in that order. I'm your host, Dr. Sharetta. Come on in and hang out. For this episode, I chatted with Grace Ridgeway. Grace is currently the Director of Special Education for Albert Einstein Academies in San Diego. Grace has extensive experience not only working in special education, but in other areas of the education sector, in charter schools as well as traditional school districts. Grace and I talk about a range of topics, including IDEA, IEPs, SSTs, LRE, 504. You get the idea, alphabet soup. We demystify and unpack that whole collection of acronyms and abbreviations. And Grace does a compelling job of making special education human, real, important, relevant, and urgent. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did recording it. Welcome, Grace. Thanks for coming to the Hangout for a little bit here.
Thank you for inviting me. Actually, I'm pretty excited.
Could you get us started, Grace, by telling us about your origin story, where you come from, both literally and figuratively, and what brings you to the present moment?
I was born in the Philippines, and I came to the U.S. as an immigrant, but my dad was part of the military. So he petitioned for my family and I to come to the U.S. when I was 6 years old, or actually five and a half. And I came very late into the year where I entered as a kindergartner. And that set my pathway as being identified as an EL, a English language learner. And the next year and a half, I remember going into a classroom where I was taught very vocabulary words, vocabulary and how to speak proper English, I think. And then from there, that really just started my educational experience. I'm a product of San Diego Unified. I graduated from Kearney High School. However, prior to Kearney, I actually attended an alternative program, which was Muir Alternative School. And I think it shocks people when I mention Muir because you always assume alternative, like you got in trouble.
It's negative, right?
Yeah. But actually, one thing I learned about Muir was how to be independent. And Muir did this really interesting thing where you picked your classes. And from middle school on, you got an opportunity to pick your class as if you were a college student. So you would line up every semester, pick your class, and if a class was offered and it wasn't at your grade level, you had to petition and you had to advocate for why. And with that, I actually was able to graduate early. I graduated a year early, and I left Muir because there wasn't any other classes for me to take, which is why I went to Kearney and took a couple AP classes and, graduated from Kearney. But I am a product of Muir Alternative School.
So you really lived the experience of an English language learner. I'm not going to out you on your age, but a few decades ago. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a bit about how that experience has informed your work today as an educator? I'd imagine that services for students who were learning English were different then. I mean, we know that still has a lot of holes in it all across the state and the country, but I'd imagine 20, 30 years ago it was even more full of holes.
Well, first, I didn't realize.
You didn't realize?
I didn't even know. When I sat in a professional learning opportunity, I think I was a second-year teacher, and they were talking about supports for English language learners. Someone asked, who's an English language learner? I raised my hand, and everyone around the table were surprised. They were like, you're not a English language learner. And I said, well, I remembered going to a separate class, but I don't ever recall like that's what I was identified as. I think once I got reclassified, I'm assuming that label was removed, and I didn't really experience anything other than that, like those first 2 years where I knew I was sitting in a room with one other teacher and we just went over vocabulary words. And I remember there was one test that I had to take, and I missed it because instead of saying a spacecraft, I said a flying saucer because it looked like a saucer. And I missed that.
I would say it's a flying saucer.
But I missed it, and it's stuck in my head. Like, I laugh because that was my experience. But other than that, I didn't know. And when I see it and I see how we identify kids as English language learners now, I think about my own experience and why I sometimes ask some difficult questions as to why we're assessing them for special education. Because what I don't want to happen is based on their lack of knowledge of English is the reason why we're moving towards assessing them for services under special ed.
Yeah, and that's something that's come up recently in conversations where people have asked, well, why does the state even care what percentage of students in this demographic area are being identified as needing additional special education services? And I think the answer gets to what you're just talking about is there's a history of disproportional identification of kids, right? Where a student's learning English, but really the misinterpretation that can have long-lasting effects is that the student has a learning a disability. And so later on we're going to talk about special education more in depth. I wanted to ask you about how it was at home. I'm assuming your parents didn't speak English to you. Or maybe they did. Did you speak English at home? How did that look compared to, like, I'm interested in always in the dichotomy between students and their home experience and then what happens on a school campus in terms of language, culture, behavioral expectations, all those pieces.
So coming from a Filipino background, my parents were very driven by assimilation. Like, they wanted me to assimilate into the culture that we were adopting as our permanent home. So my parents, my dad spoke English because he was in the military. My mom did too. They both had, they had some college experiences. That's how they met. But they both also knew that their experience was not recognized the same way as being an immigrant here in the U.S., like almost a level, like a level below what we would consider a college student. So my parents pushed for my brother and I to not speak Tagalog at home. My parents spoke Tagalog there's actually 3 dialects that my parents spoke: Tagalog, Bicolano, and Visayan. They stopped speaking to us directly, but I would hear the conversation. And because I was already familiar, I still understand. What's challenging for me is unless I'm put in a situation, I don't necessarily speak. And I don't speak fluently, which I feel like I lost because my parents really pushed for us to learn English. My grandmother understood English. There were times where she struggled to articulate. She lived with us. My dad brought her here from the Philippines, and I often translated for her when she had to go for her appointments at the doctor's office. There were times where my dad would just drop us off, and I would have to sit in the doctor's office for her and then listen to what the doctor's trying to say, try to relate that to my grandma, and then, back and forth.
I've talked about that on previous episodes with other folks. It's a burden for kids. You might not see it as a burden at that point, but that's like professional interpretation services right there, right? Conducted by a minor.
Yes.
who, as you're describing it, isn't completely bilingual. You might understand both, but you're having to translate medical language back into Tagalog.
Yes.
That's a tricky thing. Do you feel like you lost a part of your culture
Yes.
through that process?
Yes and no, because I grew up with family and friends that I call my cousins, and through that we try to make sure even our kids today know about where we come from. Food is we center our lives around food. And so we try. I still try to cook some of the traditional meals. Actually, I'm lying. I have my dad cook those traditional meals, but showing my girls what that looks like, and they're not really into it. And it's partially my fault because I don't cook all the time, but I feel like as my husband and I, both in our experience, we are moving further and further away from our culture because we're so busy. And with our busy lives, we don't really talk about, what it was like to be in the Philippines or what it feels like, because I also don't remember some of that. However, my mom and my dad are very much involved in picking up my girls after school, so the girls get to experience that. My in-laws as well, and she's Guamanian, so the girls get to see from their grandparents firsthand some of the cultural behaviors that my husband and I have inherited. But I would say, if I could maybe go back, I would really have hoped my dad would have taught my girls how to speak Tagalog, because one of my youngest is so interested in it, and I feel bad because I'm not as fluent in it to be able to have these, teach her the conversation of Tagalog. So hopefully we'll revisit that very soon because she's very interested in learning.
It's a fascinating area to reflect on when you think about students who oftentimes don't speak the same language as their parents, and their parents weren't educated with some college in English, for example. And so you have students who, the older they get, the less they can communicate with their parents, except around really basic concepts. Mm-hmm. They may be able to understand when their parents speak to some degree. Their parents may be able to understand when they speak to some degree. I'm sure there's whole areas of linguistics that address this. This is just me as a Google linguist. But to think about kind of that widening gap in a family's communication when it's really difficult to have a high-level, complex conversation because you really don't speak the same language.
Yeah. Well, and after I graduated from UCSD. After I graduated from UCSD, I think because my conversations with my parents became very basic, like basic needs. How are you doing? How are you feeling? They didn't know how to ask me about my work. I don't think people even really know what I do. Like my family, they just know me as a teacher. Grace teaches. So after 22 years, they still think I have the summer off. And I have to correct them and tell them, or sometimes I just nod my head, I try to take the summer off, but I have to do extra work.
You keep getting those ceramic apple gifts every year. Hey, my favorite teacher, and you're like, yeah, I teach, but I also kind of don't.
Yeah, and I do see myself as always as a teacher,
right.
So I don't correct them,
right.
But I don't think anyone really knows what I do.
So you mentioned special education in passing. Can you tell us what brought you into, helped you grow into the special education field, and what brings you to the moment now where you're the director of special education for Albert Einstein Academies, and you have a deep body of work that precedes you joining us.
It really started. I was a classroom assistant back in 98.
See, there you go. You said it, not me.
97, 98. I was working in San Diego Unified as a classroom assistant. I was about to graduate from college, and I was assigned to be an assistant in a special day class, which I didn't know at the time what that really meant, other than there was a teacher there with multiple groups of students, and I was asked to do a small group with a couple students. And I knew there was something a little bit different with the students I worked with. And one of the students actually, I started spending a lot of time with, and his name was Cherokee, with him, just trying to redirect him. And I remembered he asked me a question. He was like, will you marry me? And I was like, what? And he's like, you've spent so much time with me. I feel like I'm in love with you. And I was like, I was really surprised. But what really got me in the pathway of special education was, and I didn't realize at the time how it would become my social justice work around special ed, was one day there was a fire drill. And we didn't hear the fire drill in the cafeteria because we were in the back of the room right next to the cafeteria near the multi-purpose room, and you couldn't hear the fire drill. And because they sign off every classroom that needed to be out there, we were the last class to walk out. Everyone stared at us. Everyone looked at the kids, and obviously, like I said, Cherokee was with me and holding his hand. And I looked around and I recognized and felt the looks.
Like stigmatized.
Like we were causing them, we were the reason why they were still standing outside.
Just because you were delayed and exiting, because you couldn't hear the bell.
And we had about 6 kids. And again, I was trying to manage, hoping that none of the kids ran and walked away from us. But I felt it. I felt the stares. And from that moment, I was more interested in figuring out why was that happening? And secondly, why were we in the back of the school? Why weren't we in the front of the school? If these are the students that had the greatest needs and needed the most assistance going out, why were we in the back? And those were the questions that were percolating and I couldn't get rid of. And then I found out when I was talking to my principal, I actually spoke to him about that. And I appreciated him talking to me, but I wanted to express my concern with regards to that situation. And he spoke about special education. And I was like, what is that? And I had not thought about going into education at all. And he actually said, I want you to try to look at the programs. But at that time, I just wasn't looking at any more schooling, just because financially I couldn't afford it. But I knew I wanted to know more about special ed moving forward, especially because I wanted to make sure that experience with those students don't happen again. And then fast forward, I did an emergency credential. I taught in gen ed. I received my credential. I actually worked at another charter school, and I left because I wanted to pursue the special ed credential and see if I could teach in a special day class. And people were surprised because they thought, why don't you do...
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you explain what a special day class is for the uninitiated?
So a special day class is actually, it's an old term. It really is more for students that were in a separate classroom all day, pretty much, meaning they were in there because academically or behaviorally they were challenged in their general education class. So they are usually at that time, sometimes there was no rhyme or reason other than behaviorally. They were in a separate classroom space. So I wanted to, when I got hired, ask to be in a separate class. And a couple of the principals who interviewed me was surprised. I think San Diego High was like, we can offer you a resource position, which means you just go into you mainstream, you go into a general ed class, you push in, you walk around, you provide support to the students in gen ed. They were, a lot of the principals that interviewed me at that time was surprised that I wanted a separate special day class. I was drawn into Man Middle School, and that's where I actually started. And surprisingly enough, I was in a separate class, actually in a separate building across from the main campus. There was 2 classrooms, mine and another teacher. And above us was another separate class, which was focused on students with emotional disturbance, ED. This building, I find out years later, was going to be torn down, condemned actually, because there's the reason why there's no other classrooms there. But we were there. And
value systems.
Mm-hmm. And that first year was the hardest year for me. I cried every day, at least the first semester. The district, I remember coming in a couple times with behavior specialists. They offered multiple support, but it really came down to, we had about 17 kids in 7th grade and about 15 kids in 8th grade. And this group of students have been together since pretty much kindergarten, right? They traveled with each other from elementary separate day class to middle school. So they knew each other's trigger in the classroom. And of course, the 2 teachers that they hired were the 2 newest teachers, ed specialists, or educational specialists, AKA special ed teachers. And we were asked to do our thing. And I modeled and I did everything that I was asked to do. Although there was one thing missing, and I forgot that first semester, was the humanistic side. I wasn't listening to my students. And a couple of them, and reflecting on it, when I first started, said, "How long are you going to last?" And I took that as, like, what do you mean? I got hired. But I didn't understand what they meant by that until probably my second semester, when I said, I'm not going to let them run me out. And I changed a couple things in the classroom. I didn't even know at the time. I called it my little board meeting, but it was more of a restorative circle every time we started class, and just let them speak and talk. And I noticed the behaviors started fading. Don't get me wrong, we still had behaviors, but I started connecting with a lot of the students. And my approach to their behaviors changed. However, my rigor, I kept to the rigor of the curriculum. I made sure I understood what I needed to teach for 7th and 8th grade, because I did the ELA history side. And the kids were expected to do the work, because my goal was, we're going to get them out of this class, whether if it's not this year, but the next year. Because I also realized when I got better at assessing kids, they actually had skills that we didn't even realize. And so as I started to get more experience working with other gen ed teachers, I started to push more and more towards that inclusive practice. And I came across meeting Rich and Jackie Thousand. They're actually in the forefront of working around with schools on co-teaching, and it felt like it was a brand new concept back then, but it's been around for a couple of years. And
who are those authors again?
Rich Fia and Jackie Thousand.
Okay, we'll try to put that in the show notes.
Yeah, introduced me to an approach called co-teaching. And I got intrigued by that because I was driven to get our students into the gen ed classes. And how was I going to do that? By finding a way.
There's so many different places we could go and so many different things you mentioned in terms of your entry into the field and the world of special education. It hit a resonant note with me when you talked about your fire drill experience. One of the shortcomings that I've had or that I've committed was when we designed our middle school building. In the 1,000,001 construction meetings that we had and the decisions about where classrooms and offices were to be, I signed off on special education offices for staff and a little conference room for students to be on the ground floor of the building. Ground floor of the building is halfway dug into the hill that's behind it. There are windows, but in one of the offices does not have windows. And over time, though, staff started to call that area the dungeon, the special education dungeon. So first of all, I wanted to recognize you for when you joined us, your decisions around moving staff and workspaces with students out of that area. But it's symbolic and it means something, right? That's the quote unquote area of campus that's kind of hidden away, or that's those students. And it strikes me as we've clearly come a long way from the pre-IDEA days, that I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but we still have a long ways to go. The fact that I was able to make that decision and no one called me on it until several years later, someone said, what's with these offices? We're in the dungeon. Occurred to me. Would we have stuck our math and English classrooms and offices down there, or the principal's office? I don't know. Rhetorical question. IDEA. Can you explain what that is and why and how it drives the work that we do every day, and what the spirit behind the law is and was?
IDEA stands for Individual Disability Education Act. It was actually as a result of Public Law 94-142. And with that, it gives the opportunity for our students to have equal access into the general education environment. Previous to 1976, our students with disabilities were taught in institutions, separate schools, and IDEA brought our students into what we have now on our campuses, and it's a means of how to provide services. We usually look at, when you mentioned our students were at the bottom floor. When you look at special ed, it's not a place; it's a service. Mm-hmm. It doesn't supplant. It's an addition to. The mistake around IDEA is that it is to give our students all these extra support, extra services. But what we forget is there's a reason for that. They have a disability that's impacting them, which really what special education services do is to level the field of opportunities for our students. And that's where the word equity comes to mind. And there are times when I hear equity and the word around equity and the work around equity, and it still feels like equal. But equity with special education means we recognize there are some students who need a lot more, and why we provide them those extra support and services. It does not mean we're trying to make it better or that we want them to exceed or excel above their peers, but to recognize that there's a processing deficit that's not visible that's affecting their rate of learning. And so when we're advocating for a child to have lesser work assignments, like instead of doing 20 word problems, you're doing 5, because their capacity to process that information and utilize the tools that we teach them to solve those 5 word problems is going to take them a long time. But the question becomes, like, are they learning it? What's their takeaway? Are they still meeting the standards? And actually, what is the standard asking them to do? So for me, with IDEA, it's come a long way in that it's not just about having our kids in general ed, but now it's asking us, what are we doing differently for our students? It's actually forcing us to think outside of what we traditionally do. I still see it. I still see teachers standing in front of the classroom. I still see in our middle and I say not our high school, but our future high school, which I hope I don't get to see, is opportunities for our students to work more in smaller groups, not necessarily in a lecture style, because for our students with disabilities, you get to really hone in on their strengths if you spend a little bit more time with them. So for me, what IDEA has encouraged me to really, like, through the reauthorization of IDEA, I've started to recognize it's forcing schools to do things differently because the rate of graduation rate for students with disability is actually really low. In some instances, for example, our kids that are identified intellectually disabled, some of our students identified with autism, especially those who are cognitively, they have some cognitive disabilities, their future, we assume, like, well, there's something else out there for them. But now it's forcing us to say, well, what is it? Like, we have to create that future for them. And so it's transformed quite a bit. I mean, we're very few, and actually I was doing a research not too long ago that we are improving in our least restrictive environment for our students with disability. We have more and more of our students included in general education classes. That movement has sparked a lot of response, and actually we're recognizing that their participation in general education has increased their academic progress. However, in comparison to their peers in general ed, it's still lower. And that, I mean, again, there's multiple reasons, but I think the mind shift is not really around what is IDEA, but what is our concept of special education.
I recall recently seeing a graphic that compared equity to equality. So equality, there were these 3 kids, three different height individuals, tall, medium, and not so tall, short. And the equality graphic had a fence that was all the same height. And all the 3 kids are standing on the ground, and one kid's way above, and the other one's head is just above, and the other one's staring at the fence because they can't see over. And the equity one was the same fence, the tallest kid's standing there looking over, the medium one is standing on a small stool, and the shortest student is standing on a tall stool. And they're able to all see over the fence. And it strikes me as ironic, and I think it's central to human nature that when we look at students, and let's say a student came to school with crutches and a cast, no one's questioning that student needs those crutches and a cast to be able to access the campus and get around. But if you talk to people about something that's invisible and unseen, then the doubt starts to sink in, and people go, I just had a conversation with this student. They can do the work. Come on. But if we're talking about adults having expectations for adults, I know in my position, the first time we set a meeting that the start time is 2 p.m. on a certain day, that's when the emails start to come in. Well, I've got childcare on that day, or this and that. So those are all very valid pieces that require support and accommodations to be able to have that equity piece for staff to be able to participate in a job. But we're not too good at extending that logic to our students, are we?
No. Actually, there's another visual that now removes the fence. If you've come across that visual,
I'm gonna have to
because
look for that.
Basically, what does the fence represent? And those are
an obstacle.
Yeah, a barrier.
Barrier.
Right? So if we're looking at universal design of instruction for all our students, let's remove that fence so you can see which of those students are sitting on a wheelchair, standing on top of each other because they're short. When you can identify the barriers, then you can start looking at, okay, what can we do differently? But when we don't recognize those barriers, it's very difficult to know what are the needs of our students other than assumption. And we all know what assumptions can do, right?
Yeah. Well, my grandma used to say, and I'll have to say it on here, don't assume because it makes an ass out of you and me.
And that's what our students, we're assuming that they don't want to learn. When they're having a behavior in class, we're assuming they don't want to be there. We haven't assumed otherwise. We haven't assumed why they're struggling to sit still in class. We used to argue about kids wearing a hoodie. Is it or should it, or they should remove it? It's disrespectful. But we don't maybe not realize what does that hoodie represent and why that child actually needs it, right? It could be a sensory thing. It could be that they have a bad haircut that they had no choice of getting. It could be that their head was shaved because their dad was upset with them. So these barriers, if we don't understand why we have these barriers, I don't think we're going to have the kind of movement and education that we're hoping to get in the next couple of years. So I want to pause and say, if we really want to explore changing what we do in the classroom, let's start with identifying what the barriers are, not associating it with a particular student, but just identifying those barriers and seeing what resources we have to utilize, access, and provide to our students so those barriers don't exist in the classrooms.
There's that story of the person who has worked all day in the office and they get on the subway and they just want to relax and chill out, and because they're so important, because they worked all day and they worked so hard, and then this guy gets on with his 3 kids and the kids start to run around the subway car and they're flipping around and doing handstands and screaming and yelling, and the first guy's getting more and more upset because of course he's really important and he worked his whole day and he's tired and just trying to go home on a Friday night. And the kids keep acting up and the dad's not doing anything to stop him. And finally he's like, the business person who's so important says, hey, can you control your kids? Because this is a public space and we all paid to be on here, but I'm just tired and, I just want to go home. Please have some consideration. And the dad of the kids says, I'm so sorry. We just came from the hospital and their mom just passed away. And that, when you think about really trying to truly understand what barriers are there and remove them and what realities are there for students, not only in the area of special education, but dealing with poverty as well, which I know in our work we deal with all the time, and schools across the state and the country deal with that as well. Those are barriers that if we don't address them, it's that Maslow's versus Bloom's, right? How are you going to get to Bloom's if Maslow is not met, right? That's the rhetorical question.
You just reminded me, one of the reasons I left my former position at a charter school as a teacher because I wanted to pursue education or special education. But one thing I valued from that experience was it was independent study. We were, as teachers, asked to connect with our students through home visits. And I served a lot of students in off of what we call Diamond Enterprise Market area, off of Imperial, and students that were part of Paradise Valley, seeing their experience, where they lived, how they lived. I can still recall the scent, like the smell of some of the spaces that they called their home. I observed kids living in a living room space with not even mattresses on the ground, but like piles of blankets. I observed students letting me know that they were living in the car, and because they were gentrifying, were changing downtown, and they got pushed out of their apartments. That experience stuck with me as a special ed teacher, and even as an administrator now, which is why sometimes when I speak, I do think about, I do think about them. Because when their hood is over their head, we don't know where they slept that night. And so I think a lot of my work is centered around like our students specifically, because they can't be successful if we can't address even their basic needs.
It's a challenge in education and in society at a time when things are so polarized, and it's a national sport to place blame. And I see it a lot in our work where the blame will be on a student. Student might be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and they're being blamed for behavior, and they have some role in that, but they're being blamed at a rate that's far disproportionate to the level of responsibility that educators should be accepting because they signed up for this work. And it's easy to place blame. One of the things that, and this won't make me popular, but that's okay. One of the things that eats at me is to know that in teachers' lounges around the state and around the country, there are conversations, endless conversations, that place blame. Blaming kids, blaming families, blaming administration, sometimes rightfully so. But I remember a time when I first started teaching, and I've said this before in communication internally with our staff, where I was 24 years old. I was a hothead. I thought I knew everything. I knew very little. Wasn't completely trained to handle the challenges of students in this particular time. And I lost my temper on a student, and I yelled at him. And one of my colleagues walked by and heard me. And I remember later on I ran into this particular colleague in the staff lounge. And I thought he was going to be like, hey, what the hell's going on? Come on, man. He was much more senior in the profession. And what he told me is, I'll cover for you. I will, if the principal asks, I'll say that it was appropriate, that your communication with the student was appropriate. And that stuck with me all these years. I think that's a real challenge in this profession. And if a teacher knows that a colleague is performing in a certain way that is not in the best interest of students, or is exclusionary, or is expecting Grace and her team to come in and remove, quote unquote, your student, even if that teacher knows that that's not right, they're never going to say to that colleague, hey, what's going on? That's a sadness that I carry. I'm sure it happens in some schools. I'm sure there's a level of collegial accountability within the staff that doesn't need to be externally imposed that helps correct that, but I don't think it's really widespread in the profession. Sorry, my mind is going to a bunch of different places. You kind of struck a nerve with me. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about court cases. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court recently heard a case, and I'm going to forget the title, but they heard a case of a deaf and hard of hearing student who had for years and years, this is a student who never was taught American Sign Language, didn't have staff who were trained in American Sign Language, and so they invented their own form of I think he invented his own form of communication with his parents, and went through school and was given passing grades all the way up through. Cognitively, there were no issues. This was a student who's deaf and hard of hearing, and then gets to 12th grade and the school district says you're not eligible for a diploma. Series of lawsuits, loses, I think, at a lower level, and then the family found out that they could appeal, and they go through this process, and the Supreme Court ruled in the student's favor, and they received a settlement. Can you talk about either that case or similar cases and kind of impact that they've had in the special education world, and what families should know about what types of protections there are for them?
So as you're talking about that case, I think about landmark cases. So Rowley, which is a 1982, I believe, was that court case, was a foundation that really was the first time the Supreme Court actually looked at IDEA and what does that translate to in the educational classroom, like in the environment in itself. Here's a concept. But we've never questioned, like, what does that actually look like? So Rowley looked at ed benefit, like what is the educational benefit of that student participating in that particular classroom, and how do we adjust our classroom to meet that student's needs? So when that case came up and it talked about like what the student is able to access with their deaf and hard of hearing, like what supports were put in place, Rowley really ended up it was a foundation to make it equitable, right? Like what can we do so that it becomes an equal playing field? Andrew F. in 2016 came out, and it's another landmark. It's now a landmark case in my mind because it's challenged Rowley in that it didn't change it. It just says, how do we reasonably calculate? So for this particular student, knowing that his access might have been very different, we should have recognized that there was a language. Like what if they had to make up a language? In my mind, I started visualizing like visual tools. Like if he had the capacity to learn a different language, why didn't we teach him sign language? Why did not, did we consider those options? Or was it because we had a preconceived like assumption of his ability and that stuck with us versus really identifying, again, what his barriers were, and could we have adjusted our educational program for him around that? These things happen, like coming up with a different language happens from almost a lower level, like with our paraeducators working very closely with our students. And as an ed specialist, because you're so busy, you're not paying attention enough to what's actually happening until a concern comes up, and we're not communicating effectively as to what was tried with the student, other than years later, you're recognizing that this paraeducator probably followed this student from elementary to high school, or in some cases, they become a family friend because the kid has relied on this adult. I bring up these two landmark cases because it's what drives every decision I make. And I think about first the educational benefits of our students participating in that classroom and how it affects him or her. I also think about their participation and how it affects the whole overall class and how they respond to that student. And I also think about the impact of graduation. Do they have an opportunity to participate in graduation? And with this case, I was actually cheering on the behind the scene because I knew a case like this was going to eventually happen because I was one of those ed specialists. And I was a high school ed specialist and a student. Again, I told you I taught in a special day class. There's an assumption that they're being taught the same way as a student participating in general ed, and that the content is the same, the curriculum is the same, not realizing that it is not. And it's even more high stakes for high school when they have to take those core classes. And when they're not taking those core classes, or we're not providing them the tools to be able to take those core classes, you are sitting in front of a parent 2 months away from graduation, showing them a transcript and letting them know that this student is not going to graduate. Seeing that parent's eyes and breaking those news, I'm surprised those parents didn't file back then when I was giving them these news, because there's this assumption when they were taking these separate classes for math, for English, it was like identified as ELA on their transcript. But there's a particular course code that signals that it is not meeting the requirements under a diploma or even the A through G.
Like that scene from Animal House where they're on double secret probation and they don't even know about it.
Yes, I've not seen the movie, but I'm going to say yes.
I'm not recommending it to you. I don't want that to be a commentary on how I am at this age. But when I was in a fraternity back in the day, we watched it.
But you still see it today, right?
Yeah.
And what you could call it whatever course you want to call it, foundations, essential class, applied class. But basically what that means is that child is taking a class that does not meet the requirements under A through G if they're planning to go to a 4-year university under the UC state system. And what's disheartening about that is really, it's not about like just changing course codes or course names or titles. It's about changing our practice in the classroom.
Our belief system.
Our belief, our mindsets. We've always looked at it from special education as a deficit approach. So that child that's deaf and hard of hearing or is deaf and hard of hearing, he has a deficit. He I don't know what's his rate of learning. We don't know. But even for a child that is cognitively delayed significantly, I always believe give them every opportunity to learn, because least dangerous assumption has shown us that they could have a lot of interest in it and show us in a different way that they've actually learned it. But you have to, again, it's now asking us to go outside that traditional, I'm going to teach from the lecture approach to in order to really know what that child can do, you have to teach them in a small group setting. Or how great would it be if we got our middle school classes? I know our classrooms are a little bit small and it's hard to maybe navigate through, but what if we broke it up and we did small group instruction, like rotated kids, and actually got to see like what our kids can do in a smaller size? You don't necessarily have to do that in a separate class or a separate space. You could actually do it in your classroom. And if you get that opportunity, you'll probably learn a lot more about your students. You might actually have seen from this student, he had the potential to learn a different language, made it up. But we didn't recognize that little opportunity could have earned him a diploma because we could have probably taught him sign language, or even there's so many assistive technology tools that are available to our students. And it's amazing to me seeing it firsthand how our kids are so quick and even talking using those icons and telling you full stories. And I mean, that's what I would have led to. And that's why these cases, if you want to really dig into my brain, when someone brings a case to me, I always start with Rowley and I end with Andrew F. But even with our team right now, I've actually tasked them to look at our services for our students and identify where or how we're delivering those services, and are we reasonably calculating these services to meet their IEP goals. We do that, but right now I'm calling it out. I want to see it. I want to visually see it, because what I don't want to happen is we blanket statement, well, David receives 150 minutes of specialized academic instruction in and out of the general ed classroom. Well, what does that mean? When we talk about, I digressed a little bit about IDEA. Part of IDEA requires us, when we're creating that individual education plan for our students, which is what we refer to as an IEP, we have to be clear about our offer of free, appropriate public education. And we refer to that as FAPE. And when we make reference to their services, that is FAPE. That is what we're saying is specialized about being served by a highly qualified special education teacher. When we cannot explain how we came up with those service minutes, that's a concern to me. I like to make sure under Andrew F., we reasonably calculated those service minutes. Like we know based on our data on that student, we know why we're providing this amount of specialized services to them. And this has been a challenge with special education for many years, because we just do what we do. Like when someone, like your mentor or a master teacher teaches you some way of doing it, you just adopt that practice, and you don't know. You don't have the intent to do malpractice, but you do what you know how to do.
I always harken back. This is a probably brutal example, but there was a time and I don't know what decade this was, but prior to doctors understanding that germs caused infection, the reason that when you went to the barber, there's that red and white spiraled sign is that barbers used to also they used to moonlight or do double duty as surgeons. They could perform some level of surgery, and they used to wipe, because they were good with the straight razor, and they used to wipe their razor on their apron, as would surgeons. And you wouldn't go and trust a surgeon unless they had an apron that had been dried with the blood of many, many, many surgeries, because it meant they were really good at surgery or bloodletting, which was also general practice at that time. And it wasn't until people were able to demonstrate scientifically what caused infection and change practice and hand wash, which, by the way, in the beginning when people brought that up, doctors were run out of town and sometimes forced to quit the profession because it was heresy. So when you speak about this, I think about that, where we do what we were trained to do. We don't question if what we were trained to do is really in the best interest of students. It's convenient. We lose the beginner's mindset. We become an insider. We speak in acronyms. And before we know it, we're just part of the system.
And going back to that case that you mentioned.
Sorry to freak you out with the whole blood thing.
No, actually, I never realized about the
spiral.
Yeah, the spiral thing. But going back to that case, I want to circle back and say, as you said, we didn't question. I mean, if I was part of that team, I'm wondering, did we question ourselves in our practice in supporting the student? And I think cases like this sets us up to do things differently. So as we prepare to open up our high school, one of the things that I'm really pushing our teams to consider and look at is, recently we were talking about the policy around retention. That conversation and that discussion about that policy came up, and I was intrigued by that discussion because I don't think people understand the implication of that for students with disability, especially at the high school level.
So for clarification for the listeners, we're speaking about practices of having students, even if the parents are part of the conversation, repeat a grade. In effect, they're being retained, and they're, in the old parlance of when I was a kid, they were being held back.
Yes. And I'm not going to make the decision for people. I want to make sure people are informed. And part of that informed ability to make that decision is knowing when we do hold a child back with a disability at an early age, we have to consider what does that look like for them when they get to high school. And so when they're trying to earn those credits towards graduation, towards their diploma, if we have to be creative with their schedule because they do have a disability, a processing deficit that may impact their ability to participate in all 6 courses at once, maybe we need to be creative by giving them a schedule that is 3 core classes and 3 elective, and expand that high school experience from 4 years to 6 years. If that's going to allow them to get a diploma, we have to have that mindset of let's try something different. However, as we take away one of those years already as a retention year, you're already impacting that you only have 3 years really with them after 18, because we serve students up to the age of 22, that if they really needed our services, our support, they may not be able to access that. They may end up at a community college doing adult school without support, which we know some of them do need it. And there's no advocacy for adaptation or accommodation at that point. They're on their own,
right?
Which we all know when you're on your own, the likelihood of you pursuing or continuing it may not necessarily be a priority at that point. Although I've seen more and more students really advocating for that. That's why you've seen some changes with diploma requirements, especially for students who are identified intellectually disabled. There's opportunities for them to participate at a college level. I actually got to see and observe colleges like Maricosta College offering a similar class that's taught like at the high school, where it allows our students to have community-based instruction. I've collaborated with that community college to schedule students into that campus, because as adults, they should have access to the community college, with the goal that when they do leave the educational system, they'll continue. So I always think that far ahead, because I want our students, the goal of IDA is to make our students as independent as possible. That includes our kids, again, identified as with an intellectual disability. And the goal is, how can we make or provide them the opportunity to learn that independence? Right. And so when we have these conversations about our policies and practices, I look at it from the lens of, how does that impact that student's ability to earn a diploma? And how does that impact that student's ability to experience being a tradition, like a regular student. Like usually what you see on a high school campus, especially for kids that are cognitively delayed, they're sitting in a room all day long.
Yeah.
And I remember working with this one team in San Diego, and there was like opportunities to do something a little bit different, like where they actually can move from one class to the next. How great would that be, right? That they actually get to go to one class, a different class for every subject area. It took me about a year to work with this team, but through the persistence of the principal, myself, my resource teacher at the time, we showed up every week. And they wanted to see a demo lesson. We provided the demo lesson. They want to see how they could transition. We showed them how they can transition. I think they got tired of us. So they eventually gave in and tried it. And guess what? The behaviors actually went down because that child who was acting out, we probably didn't realize he's acting out because he's had the same lesson every day for 184 days in his sophomore year. And you're going to wonder why he's having a behavior every time you had him write his name, which he probably doesn't know how to write his name, but he was just pointing to letters, the same letters over and over again. So we changed it up, and I don't know if they're still doing it, but seeing that allowed those students to feel like a high school student. Maybe they couldn't articulate it or even share it, but other students, other gen ed students actually started recognizing like, I didn't know we had, the student, where did this kid come from? But it's because they were hiding in those classrooms.
The power of low expectations versus high expectations. I remember when I started my teaching credential program, they gave us a questionnaire. They had a credential advisor, and you had to write down your career goal. And I remember I wrote on there, I want to be a superintendent. And they called me into the back and they said, we need you to change this because we need you to aim for something realistic. And obviously, I'm not comparing myself to a student who is disenfranchised or comes from a family that doesn't understand the system. But I was not that person. I was college educated and had a lot of privilege and a lot of already kind of power in my life. But even that, I've remembered that decades later. So whoever you are, Mr. Credential Advisor, you set a fire in my belly. But for a lot of people, they get discouraged. Right? And then, they, as you say, they start to act up or they stop coming to school. Mm-hmm. If it's not meaningful, why do you need to stay engaged with it at all? That's a challenge. I have a couple more questions for you. You've been very generous with your time. And I'm going to put you on the spot in a minute. But before I put you on the spot with that, how do we keep the whole conversation around special education focused on the human side, humanity? You brought up humanity earlier in our conversation. We can fall into the alphabet soup of FAPE and LRE and Child Find and IEP and 504 and SST and go on and on and on. Other than the U.S. military, I think education probably has the most acronyms out there. We can drown in them. We can make ourselves feel important by them. We can talk about service minutes and service logs and due process and on and on and on and on and on. But we're talking about human beings. We're talking about students. We're talking about families who don't have the wherewithal or the resources to hire advocates and attorneys. How do we keep special education focused first and foremost on the humans, the humanity of our students and the families and their needs? That's a simple question. I say that tongue in cheek.
I know.
It's a rhetorical question too, so I don't have an answer to it.
You know, when you were talking and I started thinking about this one IEP meeting I was involved in, and it did have an advocate. And the advocate had put a picture of the student in the middle of the table. And I remember I was so frustrated because this advocate was slamming the team about what we weren't doing for the student, that I actually signaled the team to stop talking. And I pointed back at the picture. And I said, if we're talking about the student, we need to talk about the student right here. But even that advocate was talking about that student based out of a deficit approach and was talking about everything the student couldn't do, not recognizing as a team what we were saying the student could do and that they were making progress, which is why it's actually a celebration to exit a student out of special education services, right? It really means like the student has either learned the strategies or has learned to adapt based on their disability, or sometimes it means should they have qualified in the first place for special education services, right? So I think to bring that humanity back, what I encourage us as members of the AEA community, I want to challenge us to look at the strength of our students. Let's start that conversation. Let's start the conversation about what our students can do. What can they do? And then if we start saying, okay, they can do this, but this is a little bit challenging for them, again, identifying those barriers to why they can't do it, then it might shift our conversation around special ed, fix this. Because I'm going to tell you right now, David, I don't have a magic wand. I don't have the fairy dust. I actually don't know a lot about certain strategies. I know how to adapt. Special educators, when we go through our training, we're taught how to look at, here's a disability, here's what challenges them based on this disability. Here are ways you can adapt. Here are ways you can modify certain approaches. Here are ways to reteach. But unless you've taken an extra step to take reading intervention or a reading specialist credential, there's this expectation that I know how to teach reading. And I actually didn't at first, but I took additional classes because I felt like I had to. But our job as again, when I mentioned earlier about equalizing the playing field, part of that is looking at what is missing in that environment that we could add. What is it that we need to adapt? Should that student have access to audio? Should that student have access to additional text that might be just adapted so it's more at their ability level? That's what I know how to do. But I don't know how to fix a disability because that's not the intent and purpose of special education. And for me, I get really passionate about that because I feel like after the pandemic, the burden of assessment and qualifying student, the rate of identification and qualification of student has risen to 15% across the nation.
15?
15. It used to be around 11, 13%. Now it's at 15%. And we were talking about like students who are identified English language learners. Out of that 15%, 11% of those students are English language learners. So it goes back to, is it a language? Is it like our ways of teaching that we haven't recognized that our students are coming in with a language need, just like that student who's deaf of hard of hearing? Like that's a language deficit, right? Like, what are we doing? What can we do to recognize that the reality of our classroom is made up of students coming from multilingual backgrounds? And if that's how we can approach our classrooms, then maybe our the way we teach or maybe how we work with our students differ. I don't know how to really answer that question other than I have to hope that we look and stop looking at the deficit, but looking at what our kids can do. Because what I often hear is, I'm not seeing progress. But what does progress mean to you? Like, to me, progress is progress. I saw someone post in social media the other day. It was a chart. It was talking about student progress. And one was like, a spike. One was just like this little like dots. And one was these circles. And it was showing progress is progress. Like, you have to look at it from different angles. And, we talk about the achievement gap is increasing. And I actually don't call it achievement gap. I've been taught to the term educational gap, right? Because again, when you're saying achievement, is it achievement of that student? But what achievement? Like, they're going to school. It's our responsibility to educate and give them the opportunities. So have we limited their opportunities by saying and putting the blame on them? And I'm not saying, again, I'm a teacher at heart. I know a lot of our teachers work really hard, tirelessly. I know I have teacher friends writing IEPs in the middle of the night. I have our own teachers, up to their ears with trying to wrap up the year, trying to meet the compliance of writing these IEPs. But you asked about like the humanistic side of it is, let's pause for a moment and look at like what does progress mean for our students? They're all going to be very different for each and every one of them.
And to think about what we would want for our own child or children changes the conversation, just as it changes the conversation around student discipline versus something that's restorative. We can have Taliban justice, which is an easy, knee-jerk, I would call it intellectually lazy and emotionally toxic way to think about addressing behaviors in young people. Or we could be more thoughtful about it and take the long view and say, what can we do now to restore that? When we speak about special education needs and progress and meeting timelines and dates, I didn't start reading until halfway through my second grade year. And I remember when it happened. My daughter didn't start reading until halfway through her second grade year as well. And I was an old second grader and she was an old second grader. And now she writes like a graduate student and she's 20 years old. And so I think back on what would have happened to me or to her if someone had applied some sort of a deficit thinking to that, to either of us, right? What that would have done. I'm going to put you on the spot twice. The first one is locally focused. So full disclosure, this question is going to be about Albert Einstein Academies and special education. Hopefully it can be extrapolated more broadly and people can look at how this might apply to other schools or other settings. And then I'm going to ask you a global question in a second. So the first one is, if you could identify one thing, one upgrade, one positive change that you would like to see at Albert Einstein Academies within the, for lack of a better term, special education department, but also the greater organization. And here you get this magic wand. What would that be? It doesn't have to be right away, but to really send that clear message to our families and to our staff about where we're headed in the future. What would that be?
Inclusion pops into my head.
Okay, to expand on that.
We're inclusive because we have our students with disability included in our general ed classroom. On paper, it looks really great. However, I still see our students outside of the classroom. They're pulled out of the classroom because they're not able to access. or they say they can't do the work.
Who says they can't? The students or the
Our
adults?
Our adults.
Are they pulled out officially, or is it one of those myriad ways that schools can do unofficial things? Hey, you take these 3 kids that really need to work with you out there in the lounge.
Yes, and we also mask that with, well, there's a couple other general ed students that will go with them. Or, little David actually works way better when he's separated with teacher A in this classroom space. Or it's okay for little Johnny to be sitting in the back of the room with the aide because he's in gen ed, but he's not distracting anyone. To me, inclusive practice means we're going to stop what we're doing and take a look at why isn't that student participating? Why do we think that student needs to go outside of the classroom space? I've been challenged this year because we revamped a classroom space that actually where our students needed a little bit more structure and teaching them the discrete skill in this classroom. I've been told you're going against our philosophical belief of inclusion. Like all our kids they belong in gen ed. And I said, that's true. I agree with you. I don't disagree. However, we're still excluding that child because we have not given that student an opportunity to learn how to participate in that general education classroom. So IDEA really it says when appropriate and how if we exhaust all resources, we need to look at how can we support that student. So if temporarily we have them in a separate class, and I'm not saying we're required to have a continuum of services. And part of that continuum of services doesn't mean you are there forever. It really means how are you adjusting that program so that student can go in and out of a particular environment so they can fully participate. So for our students who are struggling behaviorally, especially for our little younger ones, you can't expect them to know how to behave if you don't teach it especially if they're already impacted by a processing deficit, unless you teach it. So for me, let's teach it and then bring them back into the general education classroom so they can meaningfully participate. That are just not sitting in the back of the room, just sitting in the back of the room. So if we're really going to be inclusive, I'd like to see us truly stop our lessons to think about how to engage our students at multiple levels. If you can explain to me that David's sitting in the back of the room with that adult, he's doing a similar activity, but he just needs that adult supervision, that is totally exactly what I'm talking about. But if David's sitting in the back of the room playing Legos or coloring or maybe taking a nap, I'm wondering, are we doing him justice by keeping him here, or should we try to teach him, allow him to have some disruptive behaviors, teach him how to regulate those behaviors, and then maybe bring David back just a little bit at a time until he's easing into the actual structure? How meaningful is that? Then as he gets older, he's learning those skills, but maybe at a slower rate, but he's learning those skills, and we can monitor progress that way, right? So for me, again, I have belief that our teams, they want to do well by our students. They want to make sure we have the program. And honestly, we have been successful at AEA, but the students that are enrolling are coming in with some unique challenges that we're not used to. And that's what's, I think, troubling, is because, again, you said we're shifting the blame again back on the student. we've never had this group of students before. I don't know how to serve them. Versus, okay, here are our new groups of students. We've done it this way before. How do we adjust to accommodate our new group? So that's a shift in how we approach I'm not saying we're not great anymore. I think we are. I think we've done really well. However, the challenges that our students are coming in with are not going to change. And some of that is going to be even more challenging. And so I would love to build a team that's agile. Like, we can shift and move and okay, it's not working here, let's figure it out. And I think we're already doing that to some capacity. However, I want to make sure we document it, we record it, we have something we can replicate. Because just because I have a relationship with you, I just want to make sure I can replicate that. Because what if you decide to move on tomorrow? I wouldn't be able to replicate that. However, yes, relationship is key, right? Relationship is key. And I think it's important in the future, if we're going to really move forward towards relationships, let's really take a deep dive about our own unconscious bias. Because if we don't unpack that, I don't think our behavior is going to change towards our students, especially our students with disabilities.
You just dropped a bomb at the end of our episode. The topic of bias and unconscious or conscious could be a whole series of additional episodes. So maybe we'll need to do 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. But thank you for that inclusion comment. And, it's always a delicate dance when we speak about improvements and changes and a vision of a new, different future, because the tendency is to go, that's just a criticism. Yeah, okay, Grace, let me see you in my classroom. Because changing practices and changing habits is challenging, it's difficult, it's stressful. And so you have a big task ahead of you. And I commend you for being forthright with that. And not in a negative, critical way, but just in a clear way. Because, we have work to do. We have work to do. Okay, last question. And I really appreciate your time. We've gone way past an hour because neither of us are people of few words. And so that's fantastic. Hopefully on the balance you've spoken a lot more than I have today, because that's the goal of this show. You get a chance to make a billboard on the 5 freeway. People can see it for 2-3 seconds as they drive by. What does Grace's billboard to the world say about her belief system in the work that you've devoted your life to?
Equity.
No live, love, left.
I was going to say lead with love. And I do believe in leading with love. But equity and social justice. If you see my picture, I want you to see equity and social justice. And the social justice piece goes back to the behavior. Because the social justice comes from not me as a female experiencing that I should know how it feels if a child does something to a female student, we should suspend, or no, it's not about that. I think there's a need for consequences, but there's also a need for social justice, which means we give every opportunity to listen, to hear, and understand our students and act on that based on not an archaic way of practice, but looking at how do we expand our practice to include things that we weren't able to address before because we immediately resorted to suspension, we resorted to assessing a child for a disability. It changes our practice. So for me, when you hear me talk about social justice, it's about ensuring that the students who truly are identified for services deserves our attention and the resources that we have available to support them. Because if we don't do it now, as adults, we're going to be blaming them again for sitting in a system doing nothing. And really the blame of that is it starts with us. And so
thank you for that. I think that's a good place to wrap up for today. And we're not on video, but if we were on video, the listeners would have seen Grace's smile go away with that answer. She's been smiling. You've been smiling the whole time. And then when she got to that billboard and social justice piece, the smile went away and you got fire in your eye. So I appreciate that. And it comes through in everything you say and do. So thank you for your time, Grace, and for hanging out this afternoon.
thank you.
This episode is brought to you by McGriff Insurance Services and Senior Vice President Mike Lutowski. For over a century, McGriff has focused on building long-term relationships to deliver innovative insurance solutions. The McGriff name dates back to 1886 and the founding of McGriff, Sables, and Williams. Today, McGriff is part of Truist Insurance Holdings, Inc., one of the top 10 largest insurance brokers in the world. McGriff provides highly consultative risk management and insurance solutions for businesses of all sizes, as well as for personal insurance needs. Coverages available include commercial property and casualty, small business, employee benefits, management liability, personal lines, and much more. Mike Lutowski's expertise is wide-ranging and includes transitioning employers from fully insured to partially self-funded medical, dental, and vision programs, HRA wrap programs, reference-based pricing, healthcare pricing transparency, pharmacy consulting, wellness programs, marketing, implementation, and ongoing management of fully insured benefit plans, and much more. Mike can be reached on his cell phone at 619-925-1731. All proceeds from this sponsorship support the Eric C. Mitchell Scholarship Fund at Albert Einstein Academies. The scholarship benefits graduates who exemplify the outstanding human qualities that define Mr. Mitchell's legacy. Thank you for listening to the Superintendent's Hangout. You can follow me on Twitter at DVS1970. Please be sure to share this show with friends and family on social media and in the real world. Thank you to Brad Bacayal for editing and production assistance, and to Tina Royster for scheduling and logistics. Thanks for hanging out, and have a great day.